Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Poison Pen. It is Thursday, the 13th of August, and we get to meet, to our great excitement, Ariel Sabar, who is a National Book Critics Circle Award-winning author of My Father's Paradise, and the author of this fabulous new book over here called Veritas, which is not fiction, but has all the pulse of a thriller. But, Ariel, how nice to meet you.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
I was really taken with the Wall Street Journal review that commented that you have structured this book, in their view, like a 5-act melodrama, which I think is a really lovely statement. And it brings me to ask you this, because narrative nonfiction is this interesting bridge between, making stuff up and what your real role is, being an investigative reporter and dealing with facts. So did you just fall into the 5-act drama, or did you consciously decide to construct this investigation that you conducted as a drama?
No, I mean, I think I've always, from my very start as a newspaper reporter back in Providence, Rhode Island, where I had my first newspaper job, reporters were given this sort of privilege to do narrative storytelling. So even though we were doing, factual reporting, we were going out and interviewing people, knocking on doors. When we got back to the office at the end of the day, we had editors who were supportive of kind of inviting people into the story by using the storytelling techniques that a novelist might use, but using, instead of our imagination, to use sort of reporting. And so from the time I was a cub reporter in Providence to the present, I've always felt like the best way to tell a story and to draw readers into a story is to use the sort of time-tested tools of drama that are as old as Aristotle. And structure is sort of everything. You want to sort of withhold, you want to sort of build tension, you want to sort of define characters well, and you want there to be an element of suspense so that readers keep turning pages.
Well, I thought one of the things that made this particularly fascinating is that you've got an extensive list of sources in the back, so that even though I could say that I think you take this to a granular level in terms of your investigation. I mean, you leave no potsherd or papyrus or whatever unturned. I think there's so many facets that you raise. The advantage to the list of sources, people can go on and explore it that way, which normally in fiction we don't get that kind of additional tool for the reader. So I think this is a brilliant idea. It's really a thriller, but it's all true. So my other question to you is, what in the world drew you to this story? Because a comment I read, I don't remember if it was in the Journal or the Times or whatever, said that while the Harvard professor you're going to discuss with us was unlucky to get the con man, he was unlucky to draw a reporter like you, that anybody else might have let this whole thing pass. So what was it that gripped you to the point where you put this much effort into writing this book?
Well, I'm going to talk about this in a second in the speech I'm going to give, which is also a 5-part drama. It was really, I mean, it started really by chance. I was given this assignment by Smithsonian Magazine back in 2012. I was a brand new freelancer. And was told to, basically drop everything, travel to Harvard to interview Dr. Karen King, and then follow her to Rome as she was about to make this grand announcement. But I would love to address that question in the context of what I'm about to talk about. It's a great one. It's a great story.
Well, I don't want to step on your toes, so let me ask a sort of corollary question.
Sure.
I'm much older than you are, so you may not remember when Elaine Pagels came forth. Gosh, I don't even remember when it was. Was it back as far as the 60s? Or was it later than that?
Well, 1979 was when she published the Gnostic Gospels,
Okay.
her breakthrough.
Right, and she had what is described to me, it's hard for me to remember now exactly, but a sort of feminist spin on, I don't think spin is fair, a feminist view that she brought to scholarship, biblical scholarship and so forth. Is that something that you read or studied or had any influence on you?
Well, I mean, not before sort of becoming involved with this story, but in the course of reporting the Smithsonian piece, and certainly in the course of reporting the book, I read a lot of scholarship about sort of feminist scholarship and efforts to recover the lost voices of women in early Christianity. And it's really important work. Early Christianity was largely patriarchal, and there's plenty of evidence of sort of the voices of women being suppressed in various places. And one of the interesting things that came out of the discovery in the mid-20th century of these other gospels, they were discovered in the sands of Egypt, and there were all these other gospels that were uncovered on papyri that had never made it into the New Testament. And those gospels told a kind of different story about early Christianity. And they told a story in which female figures, feminine figures, were more predominant. And so Elaine Pagels did really important work, and so did her other scholars, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza and Karen King, who was at the center of this story, and kind of bringing to the fore these forgotten and sometimes condemned voices of early Christians who were sort of condemned or disapproved of by the church fathers, the heresy hunters in the 2nd through 4th centuries AD.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful lead-in to the story that you want to tell us. So I'm going to sit back and take a sip of your water and listen.
Thank you so much. I wanted to, I guess, start by just reading sort of a bit of the book's prologue, because I think it puts readers in the room at a key moment in the story. And that's a moment that will kind of resonate in different ways as the rest of the book unfolds. So here goes. So, on September 18th, 2012, a group of international scholars gathered in a building across from the Vatican for an obscure academic conference on Egypt's earliest Christians. The week-long program looked much like those of years past, with highly specialized lectures on Egyptian linguistics, monastery libraries, and the wills of abbots. But at 7 that evening, the conference lost any semblance of the ordinary. A senior Harvard University professor rose to the lectern to make an astonishing announcement, one that a select group of journalists was at that very moment transmitting across the globe. She had discovered an ancient scrap of papyrus with the power to convulse the Roman Catholic Church. The professor, a 58-year-old historian named Karen King, was a well-known and deeply respected figure in the field of biblical studies. Harvard had recently promoted her to its Hollis Professorship of Divinity, the oldest endowed chair in America and one of the most prestigious posts in the study of Christianity. She was familiar to the public, too, as a best-selling author and TV commentator on the first centuries of the faith. But the events of September 2012 would put her in a brighter and crueler spotlight than any she had known before. In a room overlooking the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, King told the audience of elite scholars that she had already given her discovery a name. Quote, "I dubbed it, just simply for reference purposes, the Gospel of Jesus' life." So that's how we sort of enter the story. And this little piece of ancient paper would make the network TV news. It would make the front pages of the Boston Globe and the New York Times. It inspired op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and the Los Angeles Times, bits by Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert on Comedy Central. Reactions from the public covered the waterfront, from conservatives, the devout, and the Holy See. There was dismissal, disbelief, and dismay. Among progressive Christians, there was excitement about the prospects of a more tolerant and egalitarian faith. I remember, the hashtag Jesus' wife lighting up on Twitter, and for some time, the world of biblical scholarship had no idea what hit it. There were good reasons for all this excitement and pandemonium, frankly. Never before had an ancient text alluded to a married Jesus, who tradition has long portrayed as a celibate, lifelong bachelor, whose only spouse, if one can call it that, was the church. But that wasn't the only reason. The players in this drama were in many ways the very embodiments of reason and faith. On one side, you have Harvard, the richest and most powerful university in the world, a beacon of the Enlightenment and of prestigious, impartial scholarship. On the other, the Roman Catholic Church, the richest and most powerful religious institution in the world, a place of intrigue and cloistered mystery. And here, on the day that Dr. King makes her announcement, these two, sort of reason and faith, are quite literally staring at each other down from across a narrow cobblestone street, Via Paolo VI, I don't know how to say that in Italian, named after a pope who vociferously defended the priestly right of celibacy and the exclusion of women from the priesthood. I mean, it's sort of like made for Hollywood in that sense. But I had another more personal reason for returning to this story after the first explosion of publicity. And that reason was that I was there from almost the very start. And this gets to your great question earlier, Barbara. Smithsonian Magazine had gotten advance word of Dr. King's discovery and asked if I could drop everything and fly to Harvard to interview her and then travel to Rome to be in the room when she made her announcement to the world's top experts in the language and culture of Egypt's earliest Christians. And that meant that I had gotten access to the key players earlier than any other journalist. I was part of the machinery that had helped introduce it to the world. I was the only journalist in that room beside the Vatican when Dr. King revealed her discovery to fellow scholars. And I think that's part of what fired this obsession with getting to the bottom of it, this need to know, this compulsion that I think any serious journalist has to have, which is not just to report the day's news, but to run it to ground, to figure out if a story, particularly a sensational one told by a powerful institution, could withstand scrutiny. And we're in an era where the very idea of facts is under attack. And I think that part of the journalistic calling is more important than ever. But I had no idea what I was getting into when I decided to take this on. I had no sense of how twisted and upside down everything would become. Now, before I get too much further, and because not everyone will remember the news coverage back in 2012, it might make sense to cover some of the basics first. So papyrus is an ancient predecessor to paper. It's where paper got its name. And it's made from the dried and pressed stalks of reeds that once flourished along the banks of the Nile. It was the predominant writing surface in the Mediterranean world at the dawn of Christianity. And this particular piece of papyrus is about the size of a business card. It's very small. And on its front side are 8 lines of handwritten text in Coptic, which is the language of Egypt's first Christians. Now, Coptic copies of the Gospels are among the oldest surviving copies in any language, and for a simple reason. Egypt is very dry. It's a land of vast deserts, and its arid climate preserved ancient texts that rainier parts of the world would soon turn into mush. Dr. King decided to call this fragment the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. That title is printed nowhere on the papyrus itself. It was a name that Karen King applied to it. And importantly, the fragment is missing all of its margins. So it appears as if it had been broken off or been cut from the middle of some larger page, which itself was part of some presumably still larger codex or book. Codex is sort of a fancy word for an ancient book. So not only is this presumably larger codex missing, but each of the surviving 8 lines on this bit of papyrus is missing its beginning and end. So imagine, say, if like 2,000 years from now, every single copy of Huckleberry Finn had vanished, except for a small scrap of sentence fragments resected from the middle of a single page. You'd have to sort of reconstruct that larger story from a very, very small piece, and it's pretty hard to do. And I think the odd thing about the papyrus is that despite how much is missing, for Dr. King, the randomly surviving sentence fragments form a coherent story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. For her, they were evidence of a previously unknown gospel that, from textual clues, she believed must have been first composed in the 2nd century AD, when Christians were debating which text belonged in what would eventually be called the New Testament. And Dr. King was renowned for just this sort of work. She had built her reputation wresting meaning from the most cryptic and fragmentary texts. Now, this papyrus, in her view, depicted a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples over the qualifications of Mary Magdalene to be his disciple. And there's a line at the very center of the papyrus, the middle line, in which Jesus is answering the disciples, and it contains sort of the bombshell phrase that would make headlines the world over. And that phrase is simply, Jesus said to them, my wife. And what words come before and after that sentence fragments are wholly unknown. But in her lecture in Rome, in her scholarly paper, and in news releases and YouTube videos circulated by Harvard, King presented the world a portrait of Jesus never before found in the ancient world. A man married to Mary Magdalene, a proud husband defending his wife against people questioning her worthiness as a disciple, a savior teaching the disciples that marriage on earth was a symbol of believers' eventual reunion with their divine twins in higher realms. King suspected that this gospel of Jesus' wife must have been somehow suppressed in antiquity, perhaps just because its message of Jesus' humanity and sexuality and its empowerment of Magdalene were at odds with the politics of the patriarchal forefathers of the church. It was perhaps simply too hot to handle at a time when Christianity was moving in an ascetic direction. King reminded people that the Gospels themselves tell us nothing of Jesus' marital status, and this sort of surprises a lot of people. If you actually look at the Gospels, it says nothing about whether Jesus was married or not. That's a later tradition. So to judge by the surviving evidence, it's only in the 2nd century AD that believers begin to portray Jesus as celibate. So it's like more than a century goes by. And then we get these portrayals of Jesus as celibate, and it's perhaps, there's debate over why this happened, but one theory is that it's because missionaries have by then largely abandoned the idea of converting the Jews, who had a very positive sense of sexuality and multiplying and all that good stuff. And the missionaries moved on instead to the world of Greco-Roman Gentiles, many of whom exalted the kind of ascetic life at that point in history. And so the fragment surviving words were almost, I guess the other important thing about the words on the fragments is that they were an almost perfect fit for the theories that Dr. King had spent her career writing and talking about. Her scholarship was devoted to recovering the lost stories and lost voices of women in early Christianity. And none of those women was more central to her work than Mary Magdalene. Magdalene was one of Jesus' closest followers, an independently wealthy woman from Galilee who followed him to Jerusalem, watched the crucifixion, and discovers the empty tomb. Yet, for centuries, the Roman Catholic Church and much of Western culture falsely portrayed her as a repentant prostitute. And King had long lamented this false but stubbornly enduring portrayal. It was a slander concocted by popes to silence a powerful female voice in the early church. This papyrus seemed to redeem Mary Magdalene twice over. Not only was she fit to preach the good news alongside the male disciples, she was Jesus' wife, as beloved as she was human. And the fragment could well create problems for the church. Priests, took a vow of celibacy in imitation of a supposedly wifeless Jesus. The church didn't ordain women priests because, its theologians argued, this tiny piece of writing packed enough firepower. Oh, can you still hear me? Okay. This tiny piece of writing really packed enough firepower to rattle both of these pillars of Catholic tradition. But even at the beginning, there was this unnerving sense among scholars that something about the papyrus was off. The provocative title, The Gospel of Jesus' Wife, was part of it. The key line at the very center of what was supposed to be a random fragment, the decision to unveil it beside the seat of the Roman Catholic Church, the almost made-for-TV tableau of Harvard versus the Vatican, of reason with a capital R dropping a bomb at the doorstep of faith. Now, I'm not sure how many people have read the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. I think it's a lot of people from the sales figures I've seen, or whether they've seen the 2006 movie with Tom Hanks. But because the Da Vinci Code sold something like 80 million copies, I've no doubt most people have heard of it. And in a nutshell, the story of the book centers on a Harvard professor of religion uncovering a Catholic conspiracy to bury the secret of Jesus' marriage to Mary Magdalene, a secret whose exposure would supposedly hobble the church. The book's fictional Harvard professor uncovers an important clue to this long-suppressed secret by way of a cryptic message on a piece of papyrus. And so the question presented itself almost immediately. Was Karen King's papyrus an authentically ancient manuscript? Was it a chance of life imitating art, or was something darker at play? Those were some of the questions I was left with after filing that first deadline story for Smithsonian Magazine in 2012. Now, I didn't then have time to pursue it further. I'm a freelance journalist, and I had to move on. I took on different assignments for different magazines on different subjects. But the questions lingered, and in 2015, 3 years after my Smithsonian piece, I Googled around to see what had become of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. Some of those stories you write, you sort of forget about as soon as they're in print. This one really stuck with me. It was one of these things that I sort of kept turning over in my head because it was such a powerful moment there in Rome. And scientific tests that Dr. King had commissioned seemed to have found no signs of modern forgery. And among her backers was an illustrious New York University professor, Roger Bagnall, considered one of the world's leading experts on papyrus. But many of King's colleagues, liberal, conservative, and everywhere in between, believed that something was amiss, that not so much the Da Vinci-esque content, but its strange handwriting, the grammatical errors, even the way the words were strung together. The partial lines of text in the Gospel of Jesus, the partial lines of text, in the Gospel of Jesus' wife, one scholar discovered, could be cleverly constructed by cutting phrases from the Gospel of Thomas and reassembling them to say something new, almost like a kidnapper who fashions a ransom note from words snipped from different magazines. So the Gospel of Thomas is an apocryphal gospel thought to have written as early as the first century by some scholars. That's basically a list of 114 secret sayings of Jesus. And so there was a sense that you could construct the Gospel of Jesus' wife by sort of cutting and pasting phrases from Thomas and putting them together in a way to say something new that sounded like something old. After 3 years, scholarly opinion had moved decidedly toward the idea that the fragment was a fake. But there was still uncertainty. On academic blogs, debates raged over whether King had made a historic find or whether she had somehow wound up at the center of an audacious hoax. I spent some time catching up on the latest peer-reviewed journal articles on the papyrus, and I noticed that a baffling question had yet to be answered. Where in the world had this papyrus come from? What was its provenance? King had told reporters in 2012 that a private collector had given it to her, but she had refused to identify him. She claimed that he wanted anonymity and that she was therefore duty-bound to honor his wishes. Where he lived, what he did for a living, King wouldn't say. And the farthest I'd gotten when I pressed while writing my Smithsonian piece was that he was a complete stranger, a no-name who'd emailed her out of the blue one day to say he had an interesting manuscript he'd like her to translate. Now, this wasn't unreasonable. Many private collectors prefer to stay out of the public eye. They don't want collectors, dealers, reporters sort of breathing down their necks. But as a journalist, I knew that sources mattered. When a complete stranger brings a reporter a sensational scoop, it isn't enough just to sort of vet the information they give you. A diligent reporter will also investigate the source. Who are they? What's their history? How might they benefit from a particular piece of information becoming public? What less than honorable reasons might they have for requesting anonymity? Do they have a record of being trustworthy? Is there anyone who can vouch for them? And the final source for this discovery was Dr. King, and she was an esteemed historian at Harvard, her reputation seemingly beyond reproach. But what about her source? Isn't a chain only as strong as its weakest link? In the fall of 2015, in kind of a dry spell between freelance assignments, I decided to search for this anonymous collector to figure out who he was. And if the truth about the Gospel of Jesus' wife were ever to see daylight, I felt the path to it ran through the shadows of this faceless man. But how to get to him? I mean, despite appeals from journalists and her own colleagues, Dr. King would say nothing. This man, this private collector, had been so helpful to her. He had agreed to everything she'd asked. And she felt bound by honor to respect his only real demand, which is don't tell anybody who I am. So there was this huge roadblock. And unlike some journalists setting out on an investigation, I had no court files or police records to work from. I had no witness statements. There was no deep throat source who could hand me the whole story on a platter. I would have to fit together a puzzle whose thousands of pieces often felt deliberately scattered and hidden. Really, the only thing I had going for me at first was a wonderful editor at The Atlantic magazine who believed that no matter how it ended, I'd have a riveting detective story. Even if I had found nothing, the search would be a tale worth telling. And I remain really grateful to her for that. I had no intention of setting the bar that low. I hope to come back with something, but I was grateful that sort of an open-ended opportunity to sort of just see where this led. And so she said, trust your instincts, follow the clues wherever they lead. And the fruits of that first investigation appeared in a story I wrote for The Atlantic magazine in 2016. And now, after 2 additional years of full-time reporting, she loved the reporting, it led to this book, which stretches far beyond the magazine story into worlds I never knew existed. I followed leads to 12 American states and to Germany, Italy, Norway, and Switzerland. I spent weeks in libraries squinting at small type in decades-old phone books, tracing the movements of characters whose lives wound through the mystery. I knocked on doors in small towns from southern Montana to southern Germany, following clues from one house to the next. My path would eventually lead from the halls of the Vatican and Harvard to the headquarters of the East German Stasi, before winding back to rural Florida, where I discovered one of the most fascinating men I've ever written about. On paper, Walter Fritz looked like an unremarkable local. 50 years old, married, RV owner, licensed to fish and hunt. But once I started digging, and once he started talking, I found a man whose life bore a Da Vinci Code-like imprimatur long before Dan Brown ever set pen to paper. A man both animated and seemingly scarred by the complex cross-currents of sexuality and faith. The relationship he'd formed with Karen King, I found, was as enigmatic as his own life story. How did this complete stranger ensnare one of the world's leading historians of early Christianity, a woman who'd grown up tough in Montana cow country, a skeptic who prided herself on her ability to dismantle and to skewer the church's fictions? How does he convince her to stake so much of her reputation on a manuscript that even she knew on some level was suspect? I think the usual story is one of con man and dupe, of deceiver and deceived, forger and fool. But the deeper I went, the more complicated the truth became, and the trickier the moral questions. If a truth is important enough, can one use a lie to advance it? Does a righteous end justify dishonest means? Veritas is a work of both investigative journalism and, as you mentioned, Barbara, of narrative nonfiction. And on its surface, it's an international detective story, a mystery at the crossroads, again, of faith and sexuality. But if I've succeeded, I think it will leave readers thinking about and wrestling with these much larger questions about the nature of truth and the seductions of belief. Thank you.
And, well, that was, thank you. You answered my questions and I think presented us with many things to think about. But, I was contemplating a theme that is familiar in detective fiction, police procedurals, sometimes private eye stories, which is if you form a theory and then try to make the evidence fit it, it's a recipe for a bad investigation and disaster. And so, the advice is often given to investigators, follow the evidence, don't try to support a theory that you formulate in advance, which the reason I asked you about Elaine Pagels was I wondered if Dr. King had already, was in that, had a theory, and this was a welcome thing to support her theory, and so she looked at it that way rather than the kind of rigorous examination that someone who didn't have that theory in mind might have subjected it to. So, it is a classic, it really falls into detective fiction in a remarkable way, even though this is all true. So, Patrick, can you think of an example of that? You read as much police procedural stuff as I do. This does come up, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I can't think of a specific example, but...
Right. It's pervasive. But, when I read your book, it doesn't really have the pace of a thriller in the sense that it's quite dense. So it's not totally action-driven like a thriller, which often schemes over that. I am often asked why the Da Vinci Code was so successful. And I will be glad to share my answer with you because I think it's an interesting one. When The Silence of the Lambs was written, there were, loads of clones that came after it. When the Da Vinci Code came along, it was a time when we were really just hearing about pedophilia and abuse in the clergy, and the Pope was dying, and people were willing to question the Catholic Church. In the same way when John Grisham, to whom I'll be speaking in the middle of October, when he wrote A Time to Kill, it was not remarked upon, but when he wrote The Firm, it was the year that law firms were first allowed to advertise. So the idea that you could have a firm made up of criminal lawyers, it hit the zeitgeist. When Twilight published, because we just got a new Twilight, It was a time when there was, you would probably have noticed this, but I did, there was a whole kind of teenage fashion look that was, there's no other word for it, slutty. And, you know, so the girls could dress up like that and then go to the mall. And wasn't any real correlation between how they presented themselves and what might happen to them. So I do think that these runaway bestsellers, even Where the Crawdads Sing, is a combination, I think, of our interest in conservation and ecology and Me Too. My husband just read it, and he said to me afterward, "It's really a Me Too book, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes, I didn't want to tell you that because I would have spoiled the end." So, you know, it is interesting how certain books hit certain moments and you can't write for those. They're just flukes if they happen to come together. But for years after the Da Vinci Code, we got what we would call Da Vinci clones. I mean, there was a religious conspiracy thriller published like every month for at least 2 years. And so I also wondered if that might have had some influence.
I mean, and that's a really great question. In fact, I will reach over here because I have it. This is Karen King's, one of her best known books, The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Jesus and the First Woman Apostle. And it's a really interesting book on the Gospel of Mary, which is another gospel that did not make the New Testament, and it's the only gospel written in the name of a woman. And it happened to be published, well, this is the question whether it happened to be, but it was published within 3 or 4 months of the Da Vinci Code. And so it initially, it launched her into the sort of media stratosphere because she was perhaps one of the world's leading experts on the Gospel of Mary. And I think Dr. King really saw the Da Vinci Code as she put it to me, this huge teaching moment, that it was an opportunity, it was a time when, you know, millions of people were thinking about, wow, maybe the traditional story, maybe the story of Christianity that the church is told, that we've heard in Sunday school, that we've heard from the pulpits, maybe they got it wrong. And I think that was she saw that as an opportunity to bring her ideas to a much larger audience, even though the Da Vinci Code is a work of fiction. Despite the claim at the front of many of Dan Brown's book that sort of they begin with the word fact, right, where he lists a number of things that happen to be true in the story. It's really a collage of images of religious symbology, legends, pieces of the Gnostic Gospels, completely made up tales. But for King, that didn't so much matter. She saw an opportunity to bring her ideas, her scholarship, to a much wider readership and audience, and she really took advantage of that in a way that other scholars felt uncomfortable with, because the Da Vinci Code, after all, is a work of fiction, and it twists. It's not meant to be history, but one of the things I delved into in the book is the very prominent role Dr. King played during the sort of Da Vinci Code frenzy, and she definitely saw that as a platform.
So to my point that she had a theory and was therefore much more vulnerable to this piece of papyrus fitting into and supporting her theory than she was going to look at it critically. I mean, because it's a huge question. How could an academic of her stature and scholarship have been fooled by this? I love the line that somebody said that if the forger had just mastered Coptic grammar slightly better, he might have gotten away with it.
That's right.
So I thought that was. Let me ask Patrick if we have any questions, then we can share some other things here. Or comments.
Well, I mean, the only question I have here at the moment is, was the papyrus itself, was it tested for true age, or was there a way to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the reasons for controversy early on is that when Karen King first presented the story to the public and to her colleagues in Rome in 2012, she had done zero scientific testing. Like there was nothing. It was just sort of, papyrologists did a kind of qualitative study of it. There was no science. After the uproar in Rome, when many of the top scholars of Coptic and the Gnostic Gospels, the non-canonical Gospels, and the top people in Christian manuscripts were like, this looks really funny. This looks like it might be a forgery. Then Dr. King did do some scientific testing. And your question about carbon-14 dating is a really good one, because Dr. King's hypothesis was that this gospel was first composed by Christians in the 2nd century, when there were debates over the role of women in the church and about marriage. However, Coptic does not really appear as a language until the 3rd century. So the first step in our argument had to be that originally this would have been composed in Greek, and then it would have been copied into Coptic in the 4th century. So she believed it was a 4th century papyrus reflecting a 2nd century composition. When the carbon dating comes back, it comes back to the 8th century. And that's kind of a big problem in a way, because by the 8th century is post-Islamic conquest. So now you have a question of what a non-canonical, what would be called a heretical gospel, if it had existed. Why is it circulating in Islamic Egypt in the 8th century at a time when Coptic Christianity is fully Orthodox? I mean, maybe there's a good historical answer for that, but it raises a really complicated question about, and a really big problem for authenticity. Because you're saying you have a previously unprecedented gospel that you believe was composed in the 2nd century that now only appears in the 8th century, and why is it circulating then in Islamic Egypt? So that carbon-14 testing, even though Harvard would use that as a sort of a sign of vindication in many of their press releases, you see, it's actually ancient. Well, it's actually medieval. I mean, it's early medieval, and so it raised sort of a question about the authenticity, because it's not hard to get blank scraps of ancient papyrus. You can get them on eBay. You can get a larger papyrus, snip off a piece of it, and then inscribe something new on it. And that's what scholars believe happened here, that a modern forger acquired a very small blank scrap of papyrus and then used an ink recipe, a soot-based ink that's as easy to make now as it was in antiquity, to inscribe this very sloppy handwritten script on a small piece of papyrus.
Did your investigation lead you to his motive for doing this? Why would he have decided to do it and forward it to Dr. King? Was there a monetary advantage?
I think like all, I mean, I think in the genre, we're talking about the genre of true crime, I've gathered a lot of evidence on what, if this individual did forge it, what his motivations might be. And without giving away too much, they range from, I really like readers. I like readers to have a sense of discovery, right? Like I don't want to tell them what to believe, but I mean, it could be anything from wanting to show up the establishment, to show up academia. This gentleman also claims to have been sexually abused by a priest as a boy, and has a lot of anger towards the church. He also was in financial difficulties at the time he approached Dr. King. So that there are a number of possible motives if this gentleman did indeed forge it. And I want readers to sort of make up their own minds about which of those is preeminent, or whether, all 4 or 5 of them kind of find expression in these 8 short lines of Coptic that appear on this papyrus.
You can imagine that much of what we read, the central question at the poison pen is cui bono. So, we would ask it in a true crime just as much as we would ask it in fiction. Anything
Absolutely.
else, Patrick?
Well, I was just going to ask, does the style, I'm interested in the style of the 8 lines. Was it in kind of along the same lines as the synoptics, or did it have a completely different sort of flavor to it? You said it was more like the Gnostic texts, like the Thomas Gospel?
I mean, yes. I mean, it most closely resembles the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary, which is, a really smart way to build out your papyrus if you're trying to appeal to a scholar whose central piece of, whose scholarship is focused on the Gospel of Mary. So it does resemble those non-canonical Gospels, in part because it's a cut and paste of them. And so some of the phrases, for instance, the disciples said to Jesus, and you have to double check this in my book, but that doesn't really occur in the canonical Gospels. It occurs, I believe, in the Gospel of Thomas 3 times, but it's not something that the disciples said to Jesus as a phrase is not something you find in the canonical Gospels at all, or if you do it very, very infrequently. And so many, many of the elements, again, they're very few words, so it's hard to say definitively, but many of the words appear to mimic, perhaps because they actually do, the Gospel of Thomas.
I just have a question come in, which is, do you know what Professor King is up to now that she has retired from Harvard? Do you think she will ever break her silence and talk to you again?
Wow, that's a good question. What I do know and what I say in the book is that last year she began a phased retirement. So when you turn 65 at Harvard, there's a program you can get onto. It's the youngest age you can do it, where you basically begin to sort of phase out of teaching at Harvard. So that I think she's on year perhaps 2 of that. I don't know if there'll be additional fallout or not. This book breaks a lot of news, particularly about the way in which the Harvard Theological Review, which is a very preeminent journal edited by Harvard Divinity School scholars, there were very serious problems with the peer review process that come out for the first time in my book. And I do know that just in the past few weeks, there were abrupt resignations of the co-editors of the Harvard Theological Review. Whether it was connected to the book, I don't know, but scholars have told me that they find that timing curious. So I don't think we know yet what all the fallout will be. I tried from the very start to engage Dr. King in interviews for the book. I really wanted to present more of her voice in the book. I've always been very open with sources. I'm not a hostile interviewer. I don't come to stories with a predetermined agenda or view. And we'd had really great conversations for the 2012 story for Smithsonian. She even talked to me after the Atlantic story. She wouldn't talk to me during the reporting of the Atlantic story, but after it came out, she talked to me for about an hour and a half, and we had what I thought was a good conversation. She's never expressed any reservations about my reporting, but she did not want to cooperate with the reporting of the book, and that's totally her right. Whether she'll speak on it, I don't know. I mean, the New York Times book review, I think, concluded with the idea that, sometimes it's great to just sort of stand up and say, I made a mistake here. Here's what I learned, and I've moved on. But we haven't really seen that from Dr. King, and I think that's what makes her kind of an interesting person, an interesting character study in a way. Because I really think, and she's used this phrase herself. It's not something I'm applying to her, but there's this kind of cowgirl, cow country mentality. She grew up in ranching country in Montana, where there was this kind of ethic where you never show vulnerability. And so, as interesting as a character as I found Walter Fritz, I also found Dr. King to be absolutely fascinating and interesting and absolutely brilliant. And that's what makes the story a tragedy in a way, is that here's something that comes along that allows you to tell the kind of story that speaks to sort of your highest values, but it winds up causing your undoing in a way. And that was, that's part of what I find kind of heartbreaking about all.
It would be terribly difficult to let go of your vision, of your, coming back to my point, why she was vulnerable to it, to let go of something that you'd spent your life working towards and discover you'd been conned. There's an interesting wrinkle that may yet occur, not particularly in this story, but there has been discovered in Herculaneum, the twin city to Pompeii, an extensive library of scrolls, and thanks to medical technology, they hope that they'll be able to read these scrolls without having to unroll them and damage them because they would disintegrate. So while Egypt's climate has indeed preserved, the Dead Sea Scrolls and papyrus and so forth, we may find material in Herculaneum, early works that may in fact accomplish some of what Dr. King was talking about, or not. It would depend on the interests of the person who assembled the library, who might not have any, which I think will be fascinating. So it's a great story. Now, one personal moment here that I will share with you is that you were speaking to a person who has actually made papyrus.
No kidding.
I have been to Egypt. Luckily, I've been to Egypt a couple of times, and Jordan a couple of times. While in Jordan, in Amman, I have been to see what they have of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which
Oh, wow.
I can't imagine anybody being able to read them. But if you go to Egypt as a tourist, and you go to Alexandria in particular, where they have created the Great Library of Alexandria in a fascinating new form and building. And by the way, any person can go to the Library of Alexandria website and create your own bookshelf, because they have digitized the entire contents of the library, which I think is fascinating. But anyway, a thriving part of the tourist industry is there are a number of shops, and tourist guides get a commission for taking you there, and some of them are shops where they sell modern papyrus, but they encourage you to take the reeds and weave them and put them in water.
That's cool.
But,
I've never heard of that.
I have papyrus at home with my name written on it and other things, and so it really gives you a feeling for how this wonderful material. We went from clay tablets in cuneiform to papyri, and it was only thanks to the Rosetta Stone that we ever got to figure out hieroglyphs and Egyptian writing. We moved on to Coptics and eventually to vellum, which is animal skin, and now we've moved on to paper, and actually terrible paper as opposed to rag paper and all the rest. And now we're in a digital world, and so in a digital world you have to wonder, what are people 1,000 years from now or 500 years from now, assuming we all survived the pandemic, what are they going to have to study? What kinds of cons will they have to look at? What evidence will there be? You can't carbon date, emails. I mean, there's just so many fascinating thoughts that your book generated, at least for me, in terms of how scholarship will operate and what materials it will have down the road. But honestly, Ariel, I do think it does come back to the fact that Dr. King was really unlucky in getting you as an interest in this, because most people wouldn't have pursued it to this level.
I think, and I thank you for that, but I also think I also want to take credit, and I do in the book. There's some very good scholarship that long before I started on the trail of the collector, you had people, some of them underdog scholars. One of the ones I read about is a guy with only a master's degree from Oxford. Young guy working out of his basement in Portland, Oregon, who made some of the biggest scholarly breakthroughs on the evidence of forgery. And then you had the number 1 and 2 people in Coptic studies who had also expressed grave reservations. So there was a really good scholarly basis to sort of raise questions about the papyrus. But the provenance question had not been answered, and that was the one that really fascinated me. And as in any subject, it takes sort of multiple strands of overlapping evidence, before you can make a convincing case. So science alone is not good enough. Historical research alone isn't good enough. Handwriting analysis alone isn't good enough. Grammatical study, great, but not good enough. But when you combine all those things, science, what humanities scholars do, provenance investigations, connoisseurship, and when all of those planes intersect, then you have a pretty good case. You have a great case. That the thing you're looking at isn't what it appears to be. And I love this question you asked about, kind of digital. What will digital archaeology look like? And I think what's really interesting about this papyrus, and I don't want to give away too much, is that the tools that the forger used came off the internet. This was not a papyrus where you needed to go to some library in Alexandria to find an ancient text to sort of mimic. It's all there, scanned, really high quality, right there on the internet. Anyone with a Wi-Fi connection can go find source material. Now, don't want to give people any ideas. Can go find source material that they can mimic, as long as they have a piece of ancient writing material, and there will be very good scholars who might be fooled. And I think this is something to keep in mind. I think Karen King, and she's the first to admit it, came of age in a generation before the rise of the digital age, and is not someone who spends a lot of time on blogs or on Twitter or on Facebook. She doesn't really consult those things at all. And we're in an age where forgeries are going to use the most sophisticated tools out there, and that includes technology, that includes computer programs, Photoshop to scale it right for the size of the papyrus you have, mimicking sort of cloning fonts, for instance. All this stuff can be done very, very well online and with computer technology. So to absent yourself, even if you're a scholar of antiquity, to absent yourself from the internet is dangerous, because the people who are going to try to con and fool you are going to have every single tool at your disposal, because they only succeed if they're a few steps ahead of you. And that's another part of the story, that digital divide, that I think put Dr. King at a disadvantage here.
Everything you say is true, but I think you're leaving out, to be real, your major asset. Not only are you a dogged reporter with all those serious skills, but what you had that they didn't have, the other people, you have a platform. It takes a platform to get a story like this, and there are a great many thrillers that I have read where people have, found evidence of, a cabal, not the QAnon stuff, but, some kind of conspiracy or whatever. And if they can only get it to a platform, if they can only get it to the New York Times, that they can only get it on national television, then the bad actors will, their scheme will fall apart. But it's the platform that can take this to everybody's attention that really matters. And that is one of the assets that you had. You had the Smithsonian, you had the Atlantic, and now you have a book. And so the Coptic scholar who had questions doesn't have that.
It was certainly, absolutely, that's true. And it was difficult for some of the younger scholars whose reputations weren't as well known to break through at first. They were worried because they were going up against Harvard University, and that's not an easy thing to do. So they really had to sort of prove themselves, and eventually some more senior scholars recognized what they were doing and gave them a platform, whether it was on their blogs. There was a scholar at Duke University, Mark Goodacre, whose blog hosted many of the debates. And then eventually, the scholar working out of his basement in Portland was given a platform in one of the premier journals in biblical scholarship called New Testament Studies. So sort of the lesson here is that there are a lot of dilettantes and a lot of people who would like to have a big platform, but I'm sort of a believer that if you persist at something and you're producing good work, there's a chance that that work will be rewarded. It doesn't happen every time. It doesn't happen equally. Doesn't always happen fairly. But in this case, the scholars were able to break through this disadvantage of being, unaffiliated, only having a master's degree. And again, this is only one of many. But I'm talking about the underdog sort of hero of the story in some ways, who was able to sort of break through and actually have one of the most important discoveries about how this papyrus was forged of anybody.
Sure. Well, no question that it took a village, so to speak, to help you write this book. I definitely agree with that. Patrick, was there any? Oh, we have more questions.
I do have a few more questions here. And this is a really interesting one. Donna asks, is this piece of this document, is it the only one connected with this gentleman, or are there other possible fakes in circulation?
Yeah, another really great question. So this gentleman has a collection, and I've seen it. The source gave me a PowerPoint presentation that he made for Harvard University when he was trying to basically sell his collection to Harvard. And he has about 100 papyri in Greek, Coptic, and Arabic. And scholars who have looked at them say, maybe 80% of them are authentic. They look fine. They're what are called documentary papyri. So it could be like an ancient tax receipt for the purchase of a donkey or something. It could be a personal letter, a legal document of some kind. But many of the what purport to be religious texts, like scholars look at them and like, this is clearly a fake. You can tell just by looking at it, the handwriting's off. These aren't words that people used in this particular area at this particular time. The spelling doesn't make sense. So there's a mix of fakes and authentic papyri. The other papyrus that this gentleman gave to Karen King, which is still on loan at Harvard's Houghton Library, is a fragment of the Gospel of John that Dr. Karen King alluded to in 2012. She said, he gave me a couple of papyri. One is the Gospel of Jesus' wife. Here's what it looks like. And then there's also this Gospel of John. And scholars hearing about it said, oh, well, fragments of the Gospel of John, there are not a ton of them, but they're out there. I'm sure that one's authentic, right? Like, he probably just threw that in there to create, like, to build a kind of like a halo effect, basically. Like, you put one authentic one in, you surround the fake one with some authentic pieces, and it sort of rubs off on the fakes. And what was interesting, though, is that Dr. Karen King did not present photos of this Gospel of John for 2 years. When the photos finally came out, they came out not because Dr. King released them, but because some scientists at Columbia University who were studying the ink on the papyrus produced a report, and to identify where on this papyrus they had taken ink samples from, where on the Gospel of John they had taken ink samples from, they had a little picture of him. And like within 15 minutes of scholars of the Gospel of John manuscripts looking at this, they're like, this is every single line break on this papyrus mimics a line break in the oldest surviving copy of the Gospel of John. It's freely available online. In no ancient copy of any gospel in the past, you have more than 2 or 3 matching line breaks. So when you have 17 line breaks that all exactly match the oldest copy of the Gospel of John that's freely available online, you have a forgery. And the other problem is that the dialect of Coptic on this Gospel of John went extinct in about the 5th century. However, the carbon 14 dating showed this papyrus to be 8th century. So you have a dialect of Coptic that didn't exist at the time that the papyrus was harvested. So like this instantaneously and roundly discredited as a fake. So it's interesting again that you have further evidence of fakery that for whatever reason Karen King did not decide to send into the world at the time when it might have been useful for evaluating the authenticity of its companion papyrus, the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. So yes, to answer your question, there are other fakes that are in the same collection of the same gentleman.
All right, I have someone named Kit who asks, what was your path to first becoming a journalist?
Wow, my first, I guess the first step I took was I went to a Hebrew day school in Los Angeles, and conservative Jewish day school, and had a bit of a anti-authoritarian streak, I guess you could say. I didn't particularly like people in authority telling me what to do, and I like a lot of kids in religious schools, rebelled, and I discovered that a really cool way to rebel would be to start a newspaper where the students could have their own voice and sort of speak truth to power. I mean, that's a really noble sounding way of some of the really immature things we wrote about in 8th grade. But it gave us a chance to sort of tell uncomfortable truths to administrators who, if we actually said those things in class, we might get thrown into detention for, which did happen as well. So that was really the first step, this notion that you could be an 8th grader, and if you had a newspaper, you could say things to power that you might not otherwise be able to say. And so that was really the first entree to journalism.
What other kinds of things have you done over the years?
Well, I started out as a daily newspaper reporter, worked at the Providence Journal in Rhode Island, then went to the Baltimore Sun, then wrote my first book, which was My Father's Paradise, the son's search for his Jewish past in Kurdish Iraq, and that was the story of my own father's immigrant journey from a tiny community of Aramaic-speaking Jews in the mountains of Kurdish Iraq to Los Angeles, where he became a distinguished professor of Near Eastern languages at UCLA. And here's a guy who spent his whole life, essentially documenting his own dying mother tongue, Aramaic, which is alleged to be the language of Jesus. So you have this guy who comes from illiterate parents, raised in a mud shack, and by the time I'm sort of alert and conscious and aware of what's going on, I'm this like skateboarding, drum set playing kid in Westwood near UCLA who wants nothing to do with his father, who does not dress himself or brush his hair. And so there's this sort of like this miniature kind of clash of civilizations that inspired me to go back and try to tell my father's story after having rejected him for much of my early life.
Get it? Well, Ariel, I think that's a wonderful note that we should end our discussion on. So, thank you. It's really been an informative hour, and I want to thank all of you who joined us. Please tell your friends about it. Please buy a copy of Veritas, if not from us, from somebody. It's a wonderful book. I think